Apostle Paul. So I'm beginning this series with some reflections on what Paul has to say about Peter. Interestingly enough, however, Paul rarely refers to Peter as Peter. He does so, in fact, only in the letter to the Galatians, in chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. He never refers to Peter as Simon, his given name. He always, or I shouldn't say most always, refers to the person whom we know as Peter as Cephas. His nickname, his Aramaic nickname, the nickname given to him by Jesus. The nickname that means rock, which occasionally leads me to say that maybe we should call, since we still use it as a nickname, maybe we should call Peter Rocky, because Peter is actually a translation of his Aramaic nickname Cephas. That Paul uses the name Cephas is interesting because it tells us something about the antiquity of Paul's witness to Peter, and Paul was probably the only New Testament author who actually knew Peter in person. And the Peter whom he knew was a Peter whom he was so familiar with that he could call him by his nickname. What's even perhaps more interesting is that in the two epistles, two letters really, that Paul wrote that speak of Peter, his first letter to the Corinthians and his letter to the Galatians, Paul is writing to a Greek-speaking audience, people who didn't know Aramaic. And yet, writing to those Greek-speaking audiences, Paul called the person whom we know as Peter Cephas, his Aramaic nickname. Now that tells us how widely understood in the early church was Peter's nickname, that Paul could use it in letters that he wrote to people who only spoke Greek, though perhaps some of his audiences in both of those congregations may have known a little bit of Latin. But they certainly didn't know Aramaic, what was, as you probably know, a kind of Hebrew patois that was used among the people of northern Palestine particularly. Now, Paul is writing about Cephas in, as I say, two epistles. And in each epistle, there are three settings that I'm going to be talking about. The very first setting is in the letter to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians. And Paul first mentions Peter under the name of Cephas in the first chapter of that letter. And you may know that the letter was written by Paul to a fairly substantial, at least by the standards of those days. He writes about Peter in this fashion. It has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. The problem was that Paul had heard from the slave people of a trader by the name of Chloe, who may have been a Christian or perhaps not, that there were divisions in the church of Corinth, and there were at least 3 or 4 groups, and these warring factions in the church of Corinth each had their leader. Well, did they really rally to the name of Paul or Cephas or Apollos? We're not really sure, because it could be that these were just sort of stand-ins, because we know that sometimes to avoid political incorrectness, as we might say today, that talking about a problem, the authors would not specifically refer to the problematic individuals, but would use some sort of an alias. So we're not really sure that people in the church